Need some new Modern Horizons cards? Well, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Modern Horizons 2 spoilers, and after the absurdity of the last few days, where we had a ridiculous number of cards, it's the weekend, we get a short little spoiler video today. A couple of rares, a few interesting lower rarity cards, some sweet reprints, but, I figured, should probably do a video, talk about these sweet new cards. So let's jump into it, starting with Sanctifier en-Vec. So Sanctifier en-Vec, 2 mana, 2/2 human cleric, has protection from black and red. When it enters the battlefield, you exile all cards that are black or red from all graveyards, and if a black or red permanent spell or card, basically anything, goes into the graveyard, exile it instead. So Sanctifier en-Vec calls back to Paladin en-Vec, except it's way better. It's 1 less mana. Rather than First Strike, it has a bunch of relevant abilities. I think actually the most modern playable comparison is Auriok Champion, and Auriok Champion might not look like much, but it actually sees a lot of play in Modern, where hating on black and red is pretty relevant, and incidental life gain helps as well. So Auriok Champion, it's basically the same card, -1 power and toughness, but with a very different ability. Rather than hating on graveyards for black or red cards, Auriok Champion just gains you life when a creature comes into play. And I think this is what Sanctifier en-Vec is competing against. Not that you couldn't play both of those, but Auriok Champion most commonly shows up in sideboard, where it comes in 2 different matchups. It comes in against aggro, where life gain is good, especially like burn style aggro decks that are using red removal that can't really kill it, plus it blocks like Swift Spears and Goblin Guides all day. The other place it shows up is against like Death Shadow style decks that are using black-red removal. Auriok Champion blocks Death Shadow forever, and it's really hard to kill in those matchups as well. Sanctifier en-Vec, I think it's competing for that same slot. So the question is getting a little more power and hating on graveyards only for black and red cards better than gaining life? And I think the answer is it really depends on the matchup. If you're up against Burn or Prowess, I think you're definitely going to want Auriok Champion. Like, hating on the graveyard against Burn or Prowess doesn't really do a whole lot of anything. On the other hand, in many other matchups, Sanctifier en-Vec, I think, is better than Auriok Champion. Again, it's just as protected. It stonewalls Death Shadow just as well, but there are like Dreadhorde Arcanist decks using the graveyard, flashing back things. Death Shadow decks use Lurrus to get things back from the graveyard. There's a ton of Lurrus decks. Dredge, even, is using like Stinkweed Imp and black creatures as their dredgers. There's Kroxa decks. Kroxa is always going into the graveyard. So while Sanctifier en-Vec might be worse against Burn and Prowess in specific, I think its ability actually is just as relevant, or maybe even more relevant, than Auriok Champion's ability overall, which at least puts it in the conversation to see Modern play. So I think that if you're choosing sideboard slots, it's going to depend on the metagame, essentially. If Burn and Prowess are at the top, Auriok Champion's probably better. If Death Shadow, Graveyard, Dredge-style decks are at the top, then Sanctifier en-Vec is better. The other thing about Sanctifier en-Vec is it's got more power. A 2/2 for 2 is a lot different than a 1/1 for 2, which probably gives it more main deck potential than Auriok Champion. And remember, it's a human, so it could show up in the humans deck. It could show up in Stoneforge decks, having double protection, and then putting a sword on it gives it protection from a lot of colors. Coco decks can play it, Colossus Hammer decks, Taxes style decks. So I actually really like Sanctifier en-Vec for Modern. I think worst case, it's going to be a really good sideboard card, Hate Bear. Best case, I could see it being a main deck card, especially in like Stoneblade decks, human decks, other decks that have synergies based around small creatures. So really sweet new card coming in Modern Horizons 2. We also got Moderation, and Moderation, I don't know what to make of this card. So, 3-mana enchantment. You can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, but whenever you cast a spell, you draw a card. So obviously, whenever you cast a spell, draw a card is nice text, but being limited to a single spell each turn, that's a little bit of a punishment. So essentially, Moderation forces you to Curse of Exhaustion yourself, and you get a somewhat upgraded Whirlwind of Thought. Whirlwind of Thought is just 4 mana, Jeskai colors. When you cast a non-creature spell, draw a card. Moderation, obviously cheaper, triggers on any spell, but has that big restriction of only casting 1 spell a turn. At first glance, I would say I don't think that Moderation's card advantage is going to be worth playing through the restriction. If there is a deck that can take advantage of this, I think it's going to be a deck that can play at instant speed very well. The way to power up Moderation the most is to be able to cast a spell on your turn, then on your opponent's turn, so you're drawing 2 extra cards each turn. So maybe you're playing some sort of blue-white control deck, and you're like Jacing main phase, counterspelling during your opponent's turn. It does synergize really well with some of the new evoke elementals, like Solitude, Subtlety. These are cards that want you to have cards in hand, so you can exile them and cast them for free if you need to. Plus they have flash, so it makes it easy to cast stuff on your opponent's turn, and they're just like reasonable cards. So maybe there could be some sort of blue-white Moderation control style deck. At the same time, if you're playing control, Moderation is going to make it really hard for you to like win counter wars. Let's say you cast something that you want to resolve. You cast your Jace, and your opponent's like, okay, Spell Pierce or something. You can't fight back. You can't counter back the counter spell because you already cast your 1 spell each turn. So I feel like that is a really meaningful restriction. In Commander, it could show up in like a Pharaoh, Savine. These are commanders that want you to cast a spell on everyone's turn. So Moderation, like the best case, you're drawing 4 extra cards each turn cycle. That's very powerful. At the same time, if you're drawing 4 extra cards, you're probably going to want to be able to cast more than 1 spell each turn, because how are you going to take advantage of all the cards that you are drawing if you can only cast 1 spell each turn? So Moderation, I really like this card. Not because I think it's good. I actually think it's more likely to be completely unplayed than to be heavily played. But I think it's a very interesting restriction. Yes, like Whirlwind of Thoughts, I think is just better, but it's much less interesting. There is power here if you can build your deck around it, if you can find a deck that only wants to cast 1 spell each turn that can cast stuff on your opponent's turn. So the power's there, but the drawback is huge. So it'll be really interesting to see if anyone can figure out a way to take advantage of Moderation. If they can, probably going to be a really good card, but my guess is the drawback is just too much for most decks to play. We also have, like usual, a bunch of lower rarity stuff. Not going to talk about all of it. Most of it's kind of limited fodder, cool reference cards, but not constructed cards. But there are a few cards I wanted to mention individually, starting with Strike It Rich. So Strike It Rich, 1 mana, make a treasure token, flash it back for 3 mana, it's in red. So this is a free spell. I've seen it compared to a mini Manamorphose. Obviously, you do end up down to cards, so it's nowhere near as good as Manamorphose. At the same time, if there's one thing we've learned in Modern, anything that's a free spell is probably going to be either really good or even broken. Strike It Rich is technically a free spell. It's 1 mana, get a treasure, so you get that mana immediately back. I think that this gives it a lot of potential in prowess style decks, blitz style decks, where your main goal is just to cast a bunch of spells to grow your Stormwing Entity in Soulscar Mage. This is the card that puts Stormwing Entity into play on turn 2, which is what the deck wants to be doing, one of the few cards that can do that. So I think that Strike It Rich, definitely potential in prowess decks, but I think it might have potential in another style of deck as well, and that is decks that are trying to get to a certain mana value or mana cost, and then they win the game. We've seen like Wild Candor, this weird 1 mana ramp spell. 1 mana, sack it to make 1 mana. It's been in the format for a long time, doesn't see much play. That's mostly because it dies too much. You play Wild Candor, if you're trying to ramp into something, your opponent can just kill it. Strike It Rich, making a treasure token, much more resilient, and you get the flashback upside. I could see Strike It Rich maybe being a way to like speed up Through the Breach or speed up Ad Nauseam or something. These are decks where Through the Breach, if you get to 5 mana, you pretty much win the game. You get to 5 mana, you Through the Breach and Emrakul, you win the game. Strike It Rich is just 1 turn off that clock essentially. You cast it, you get the treasure, you can Through the Breach on 4 instead of 5, and that 1 extra turn is a pretty big deal, especially if you're playing like a Is It Through the Breach deck that doesn't have access to other ramp spells. So I think that Strike It Rich probably going to show up in Blitz and Prowess, and might be able to show up in some other archetypes as well. Whenever you see a free spell, you got to stand up and take notice, because no matter how bad that spell looks, it's probably going to be really good. We also got Blazing Rootwalla. So Blazing Rootwalla, 1 mana 1/1. You can pay a red to pump it +2/+0, only do it once each turn, and it has Madness of 0. So this calls back to Basky Rootwalla, which is a card we actually just played last night in Legacy in a Madness deck. So it calls back to a card that's still sort of Legacy playable. The problem with Blazing Rootwalla is even though its pumping ability is cheaper, it doesn't puff toughness, which means it's always going to have 1 toughness, which means it is going to trade down a lot more, it's going to die to Lava Dar a lot more, but it is still a really aggressive effect. And I could see this seeing play in Modern if you're playing a Hollow One style deck. This is something you can discard essentially for free, put a body on the battlefield, and it is very aggressive. Like, only 1 mana turns this into a 3/1 on your 1-drop. That is very scary. Can you imagine a start where you, like, discard a bunch of Vengevines, cast a Hollow One for free, cast your Blazing Rootwallas, get back all your Vengevines? It's going to be really, really explosive. That's one of the main tricks of Basking Rootwalla, is it's a free thing you can discard to trigger your Vengevines. So even though the 1 toughness thing scares me a little bit, I think that Blazing Rootwalla definitely has a chance to shake things up in Modern in Vengevine Hollow One style shells, and maybe some sort of like Madness discard shell as well. We'd still need some more good discard outlets, but if we get them, Blazing Rootwalla probably going to be a key part of the Madness deck. We also got Sudden Edict. So Sudden Edict calls back to Diabolic Edict, and a little Modern Horizons history. When Modern Horizons 1 came out, Diabolic Edict itself wasn't legal in Modern. They put it into Modern, it didn't do anything. Diabolic Edict just really isn't good enough anymore. Sudden Edict is the same thing, but with Split Second. Split Second basically just means no one can do anything while this is on the stack, which is kind of a big deal in some matchups. When you look at the decks where you'd really want to Edict, you're going to be talking about like Boggles, you're going to be talking about en-Vec style decks, and one of the things those decks do to get around cards like Diabolic Edict is they play a Dryad Arbor in their deck, with the idea being if you try to Edict my big Boggle threat, or my en-Vec thing that's going to kill you, I can take and just fetch up Dryad Arbor, sacrifice that instead. Sudden Edict gets around that, and I think that's a really big deal. Also seems relevant against like Arcbound Ravager cells. You can't do all your sacrifice stuff, you can't fire up a creature land to sacrifice instead. So Sudden Edict is a huge upgrade over Diabolic Edict. Whether that means it's going to be a Modern staple, that remains to be seen, but I think if you're playing some sort of Edict in your sideboard with the idea being to hate on Boggle style decks or en-Vec style decks, Sudden Edict is going to be the go-to because the Split Second upgrade is a really big one. We also got our honorary probably good in Soul Sisters card for the set, Abiding Grace. But this one, this time, I really think it is good in Soul Sisters. Abiding Grace, 3 mana. Enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, you choose one. Gain a life or reanimate a creature of mana value 1. So Abiding Grace calls back to Proclamation of Rebirth. Proclamation of Rebirth is essentially 6 mana to reanimate something that is 1 mana or less, but you get to do it every turn with Forecast, and we have seen in the past decks build around this. The Martyr proc decks, where the idea is you play Martyr's Sands, you sack it to gain a ton of life, and then every turn you just keep procking it back, gaining like 15 life a turn, and trusting that's going to win the game. Abiding Grace does everything Proclamation does, except it's 3 mana one time instead of 6 mana every turn. That is such a ridiculously huge upgrade. Plus, worst case, your graveyard gets shut down, at least it gains you life, which is what your deck wants to do, because you're probably winning with like Sarah Ascendant or something, so you need your life total high anyway. So maybe Abiding Grace means that Martyr proc can return. I also think this can show up in just more traditional Soul Sisters. You'll still probably want Martyr of Sands because it's just so insane with Abiding Grace. But getting back your Soul Warden, Soul Attendant, Sarah Ascendant, and worst case, growing your Johnny's Pridemate with a 1 life gain, it seems like it's absolutely designed to power up Soul Sisters. So whether or not this means Soul Sisters is back on the menu, we'll have to wait and see. But this card, I mean, if this isn't going to make Soul Sisters good and it isn't going to make it in the deck, I'm going to have to just stop saying this card's good in Soul Sisters, because if Abiding Grace can't do it, then nothing can. It's so perfect for the archetype. Finally today, we got 3 interesting new to Modern reprints. Fire and Ice, Karmic Guide, Titania. Let's break them down. Fire and Ice, one of the most iconic split spells in Magic's history. One side, 2 damage, split it up how you want. Other side, tap something, draw a card. Each side, 2 mana. My question is this fast enough to be good in Modern anymore? If it is, probably going to be some sort of like Snapcaster control deck. I like that this floor of Fire Ice is very high. Like, it's never really a dead card. Worst case, you get like a one-shot Richard import activation where you ice to tap a land and draw a card, so it's never going to get stuck in your hand. I'm just not sure that this is fast enough for Modern anymore. Modern is fast, there's big creatures. Is Fire and Ice just a relic from the past that we are all nostalgic about and remember fondly, or is it still a good spell? I'm leaning towards nostalgic and cool, but not actually good, but we'll have to wait and see. Regardless, I'm happy to see Fire and Ice finally entering the Modern format because it is one of the most iconic split spells in the entire history of Magic. We also got Karmic Guide, and Karmic Guide, oh my goodness, we've never seen anything quite like this in Modern. So Karmic Guide, 5 mana, 2/2, Angel Spirit, Pro Black, Echo of 5, so probably going to sacrifice yourself unless you pay a bunch of mana, but when it comes into play, you get to reanimate a creature from your graveyard, and that might not sound that exciting. I mean, 5 mana reanimate something. It's nice if you don't have access to cheaper reanimation, and it is on a body, so it's insane with Panharmonicon, one of the best Panharmonicon cards. But the true power of Karmic Guide is it's a combo piece. There's a few different ways, actually a bunch of different ways, so you can go infinite with this. One of the most common is Karmic Guide, Revelark, and a sack outlet. Karmic Guide can reanimate Revelark, then you can sack Revelark to reanimate Karmic Guide, loop, loop, loop. Revelark actually reanimates 2 things that have power 2 or less, so if you throw a ETB draw a card creature like Wall of Omens into the deck, you get to draw your entire deck, or maybe you have Altar of Dementia as your sack outlet, and you just win the game by milling your opponent out, like Karmic Guide, Revelark, Altar of Dementia. That's just instant win by milling your opponent's entire deck. Whether or not this will catch on in Modern, we'll have to wait and see. There's also like Kiki Jiki combos where you can keep copying Karmic Guide with Kiki Jiki, sacrificing it to Goblin Bombardment for infinite damage. We even got Imperial Recruited Shooter up both halves of the combo. You can go Fiend Hunter Karmic Guide, Fiend Hunter exiles Karmic Guide, then you sack the Fiend Hunter to Goblin Bombardment or any sacrifice outlet, which gets back Karmic Guide, which gets back Fiend Hunter to exile Karmic Guide to sacrifice, infinite damage, infinite ETBs, infinite sacrifices. The question is, can this actually work in Modern? Like, if the combos are really sweet. However, in Modern, decks are very prepared for graveyards. Almost every deck is ready for dredge style decks. There's so many graveyard decks that's my worry. Like, Karmic Guide combos, they seem powerful. They're mostly like 2 to 3 piece combos, but they have a lot of redundancy. You have a lot of, outside of Karmic Guide itself, a lot of pieces that can fill in for like your sacrifice outlet or your enabling combo piece, but they do all care about the graveyard. So a Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, Surgical Extraction, gonna blow you out, which might keep them from being broken. The other thing I like about this card is I think you play it fairly. Like, we've played a Myria style decks where you're just kind of grinding out value, getting stuff back from the graveyard, working up towards 7 planes for a Myria, Sun Titans for more recursion. Karmic Guide feels like an easy inclusion there as well. So I'm really excited to build Karmic Guide decks, Panharmonicon decks, Myria decks, combo decks. I do think that the fact that Modern is so prepared for graveyard hate probably means they're not going to be tier 1. But still, if you dodge the graveyard hate, there's some really sweet combos, and Karmic Guide is a really sweet card. We also got one of the cards there's so many cards I'm excited to build around, but one of the ones I'm most excited to build around, Titania, Protector of Argoth, a Commander Precon All-Star from a few years ago. So 5 mana, 5/3, Elemental, legendary creature. When it enters the battlefield, you to reanimate a land from your graveyard, and then when a land you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you make a 5/3 Elemental creature token. So in Modern, we got Ghost Quarters, in Field of Ruins, in Fetch Lands, in Horizon Lands. There's a ton of lands that can put themselves into the graveyard. Titania gets them back, and then the reward is really high. Like, the floor of Titania is you play this, you get back a fetch land, you crack the fetch land, you get a 5/3, you get a 5-drop that made 10 power in 2 bodies, and then the ceiling on this card is insane. You can play extra land drop stuff. You can throw this in a deck with Ren Insects, and with Ramanop Excavator, or Gitrog Monster, Knight of the Reliquary to tutor up lands. You could be sacrificing a bunch of lands, getting them in your graveyard, making a huge board full of elementals. There's even just straight up combo potential now that Zoradorb is coming to the format. Picture this. You do a bit of ramping. playing some sort of green deck in Modern, you get a few lands on the battlefield, you play Titania and Zornorb, you sacrifice all your lands on your opponent's end step, make 5, 10, 5/3s, and you swing and kill your opponent and gain a bunch of life with Zornorb. So Titania, oh man, it's going to be really fun to build around. The only drawback is it does die to Lightning Bolt. The absolute worst case with Titania is you play it and with the land reanimating trigger on the stack, your opponent bolts it or kills it with another removal spell, and then you don't even get the elemental. You still get the land back, but you won't get the elemental token. But the ceiling on this card is so high, and it can do so many cool things, and it synergizes with so many cards I like Goodtrog Monster. I cannot wait to see if Legacy Nickfit All-Star Titania can actually work in the Modern format. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our spoilers for today. I told you, short and easy, not a ton of stuff to talk about, but don't worry, we're not at the end of spoiler season. It's picking back up next week, so let me know what you think. What's your favorite card of the day? What do you think of week 1 of Modern Horizons 2 spoilers? And I will be back on Monday with more Modern Horizons 2 spoilers. So until then, everyone, have a great weekend. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.